Good afternoon once again. Really do appreciate all of you taking your time out of a busy day to listen to my stories today. Dylan Darcy a little while ago. Hopefully the stories have some meaning to you. So today we are going to take a pretty deep dive into the ISO protection class system. And it's funny, it's something maybe we take for granted if you've been doing this business for a while, but I think it bears going back and looking at it and why is it important. And some of this stuff is kind of basic, but once again, I kind of like going back over the basics. Sometimes somebody new in the business will ask me a question and I'm like, I got to think about that. And then I have to answer so they understand. So that's kind of what we're looking at here with protection classes. And before we get into the whole protection class thing, I do want to say, we got to think about property insurance. Today, we're going to talk about builder's risk, but we're talking about the factors that affect whether a risk is eligible, and the pricing of that risk, how much the premium is, and maybe the overall capacity as far as where you can obtain insurance on these things. So the basic scope of builder's risk: construction, occupancy, protection, and exposure are very critical. Those are the most critical factors. So you're going to understand that if you have a frame wood structure, the ability to put out a fire is pretty important, probably the most important thing. Fire is, after all, one of our largest perils. We have a severity risk on fire. Every day we see, pictures of large frame buildings burning up. It does happen. So without further ado, let's get into the protection class and how important it is. And one thing I want to say about protection classes before we get into the presentation is, once again, just how important they are. There's only a few factors, rating factors of property insurance. One is the amount of the risk, the total amount at risk and what you write the policy for. Second factor would be the deductible that you choose. You know what a deductible is. We'll say the location of the risk. Is it close to the coast? Is it close to an earthquake fault? That's very important, the location of the risk. And one of the other factors is the protection of that risk, which means how protected is it from certain perils? And today we're going to focus on fire. So just keep that all in mind. That's why this is so important. So we hear the term public protection class a lot, or just protection class. And I have some agents that say, what is that? Well, there's a lot of material on the internet on this. So I just had some snippets, and I'm not going to read them all to you, but I'll read some. This is the Public Protection Classification Program. It is the largest program of its type in the world. And I'm going to give you a few numbers here, but the entire United States falls under this preview for the Insurance Service Office. This is a big thing of what they do, and it really is trying to determine what they want to do ultimately is get a better protection everywhere in the United States. And we'll talk about what that means to the community too. There's a lot of pride in the smaller communities that kind of follow ISO and improve their protection class over time. Because the bottom line is the lower your protection class, the better off you are. From an eligibility standpoint, capacity standpoint, a pricing standpoint, it helps everybody. Developers, when they're looking at a small town, sometimes the developer will say it's unprotected. I'm not going to develop in that area. Maybe the small town has done some work though, and it is protected, so it can lead to development. So it's very important. And this is controlled by the Insurance Service Office. And this is, like I said, one of their main functions. So what ISO does, as you can see, the scope of this is pretty impressive. So they gather information from all these different communities around the United States. And I've had some agents, they don't quite grasp the science of this. This is a rating system. It's interesting too, I was reading about it. It goes from 0 to 105. And there's points you get for different factors, and we'll go through a few of these factors. But whatever your community lands in that points, that's the protection class they get. So it's not subjective at all. This is very, very pragmatic, very objective of how they calculate these classifications. And once again, you go from 1 to 10. That's your choice. 1 being the very best, and 10 being basically completely unprotected. Once again, just kind of diving a little deeper into this. This is an objective countrywide standard. So this applies everywhere in the United States. And It's interesting. We had one here in Jacksonville. I'm in Jacksonville, Florida, and we had a new community built. Unfortunately, they didn't put the infrastructure in before they built the community, so they did not have an adequate water supply. They didn't have working fire hydrants yet. So you had all these new homes being built, and ISO protection class was a 9. So people were trying to get homeowners insurance on these very nice homes, and sometimes they couldn't get insurance at all, or if they could, it was 2 or 3 times higher than neighborhoods that were just next door. And it was all based on not having an adequate water supply. So it can happen, and even in a given community, if they don't put the hydrants in and they're not working correctly. So I've seen this time and time again. 40,000 fire response jurisdictions in the United States that ISO regulates. Pretty impressive. So once again, what is a protection class? It's just a way of analytically evaluating a given, like a structure in a given area or a part of the community, saying, in this area, you're going to be rated 1 to 10. As I said earlier, some cities are a 1. 1 is the very best. That's phenomenal. Quick response time, adequate, adequate water supply. The fire department's well trained. The equipment's up to date. The communications are up to date, and they get a 1. And they have the lowest insurance premiums in the country when you have a 1. So that's pretty important. And that's the other thing. Once again, there's really only 3 major factors that affect the protection class. One they call communications. That's the alarm systems, the telephone system, the digital switches. How quickly can, if you see a fire, how quickly can you get a hold of the fire department? And then how quickly do they respond? So that's factor number 1. Factor number 2 would be the overall quality of the fire department itself, not only the equipment, but the training of the firemen. And they go through very rigorous training, and ISO evaluates that and gives them a point, assigns points for each one of these factors. And the third one that we need to talk about a lot today probably is water supply. So, is it an adequate water supply? Even if it's a public water supply, can they produce a certain volume of water over a certain duration of time in order to get a low protection class? Even if it is in a rural area, do they have pumper trucks that can not only deliver the water on a timely basis, but the volume of water for a duration of time? And you can read that if you want. It's so many PSI for a duration of 2 hours. That's what they have to do. So those are the 3 factors: communications, quality of the equipment, the fire department, response time, and the third one is adequate water supply. So let's talk about this, because this is a major impact. I'm kind of focused on builder's risk, but this could be all property insurance, be it commercial, homeowners insurance. All of this is factored in because all insurance companies use this protection class as part of their rating base. Now, I do know some very large insurance companies kind of come up with their own rating base, but the vast majority of carriers out there use the ISO protection class as one of the major rating factors in property insurance. So the impact of higher classes. Number 1 is sometimes you're building a $10 million building on top of a mountain, and it's a PC10. There might not be any insurance company that wants to insure that. Or maybe you're going to have to get in a situation where you got to go to Lloyd's, and you're going to split it up among other carriers. And then, as you know, the cost gets very, very expensive. General rule of thumb in property, you're probably looking at a minimum of twice the rate, and sometimes 3 or 4 times the rate in an unprotected area as opposed to protected area. So it's eligibility, capacity, pricing, all of this is impacted. Next thing I was going to touch on today was split classes. Used to be you would see a jurisdiction that was a protection class 4/9. Well, ISO a few years ago decided to kind of revamp it and make it a little more sophisticated. So now you might see a 4/4Y. And what usually happens, not always, but what usually happens in these areas is you have a part of a jurisdiction that meets all the qualifications for a 4. Water supply, response time, communications, the fire department is up to date on all its equipment. But then there's another part of that jurisdiction that usually doesn't have an adequate water supply. We see this happen a lot in fast-growing areas. We had a subdivision in Texas, just south of Dallas, and they were building these multi-million-dollar homes, but they did not, the fire hydrants were not in yet. They weren't working properly. So unfortunately for those, for that contractor that was building those homes, it was assigned a 4Y. And a 4Y is basically unprotected. So these homes were having to pay very high premium for the builder's risk. And once they were done, the homeowner's premiums were very, very high too. So those are split classes. You'll see 4Y, 4X. When you see that, part of that jurisdiction is unprotected, and it just depends on where the structure is located, what it gets. Think about the brush fires that we've had this year out west. Do you think that impacts protection classes? I mean, absolutely. You know, I mean, when they're evaluating an area, if there's not adequate water supply, so now you're going to get a high protection class in the brush fire area. That's going to be pretty tricky to get that structure insured. And the effect of urban sprawl, kind of what I said, is they build out quicker and quicker. Sometimes the development goes faster than the infrastructure, being the fire hydrants and the water supply. And I've seen that. It just affects eligibility and pricing dramatically. Mountainous terrain, I like to bring this up because this happens frequently. So we decide, you know, somebody decides they're going to buy a piece of property on top of a mountain and they're going to build a house. And they don't think about protection class. So they start building the house and then they try to get builder's risk insurance, and it's deemed to be a protection class 10 because there's no water supply on top of the mountain. And what we have in mountainous areas is even if a fire department has really high quality equipment, what happens in the winter? The roads get icy. Maybe the trucks can't make it to the top of the mountain. So we have a problem. So usually it gets to be unprotected, and it's very difficult to obtain insurance on those type of structures in mountainous terrains. The other thing I've seen, I see this happen a lot even in Southern California, where you'll have a protection class, very low class, 1, 2, or 3 on the bottom of the mountain. And you can look to the top of the mountain and they're building up there, but on the top of the mountain, it's unprotected. And you can even see it. So you can go from a 3 to an unprotected 10 pretty quickly because there's no adequate water supply. So just keep that in mind. And what I see a lot of times in these situations is higher valued properties being built in these unprotected areas. And you know, the other thing I see sometimes, I guess we do a lot of this, but I get somebody will call me and they'll go, well, you know, they decided to build this home on top of the mountain and they didn't think they needed builder's risk, and now they're 3/4 of the way done, and now they need to get insurance. So now you have a high value dwelling that's 75% completed, and now you're trying to find a market that wants to write that. Good luck with that. That's going to be a tough one. And another thing is in the rural areas, you know, and like I said, usually the rural areas have higher protection classes, but it's not always the case. I've seen some volunteer fire departments that have taken made a lot of effort to have a lower protection class. Maybe they have state-of-the-art pumper trucks, good communications, adequate water supply, and they'll generate a lower protection class, even if it's a rural area or a smaller township. So it's not always the case. Once again, this is really the trick of the trade, and this is what we get into every day, because you're going to ask me, why is this, and this? So this is going to kind of simplify it. The first thing we're going to look at is the distance to the responding fire department. And the general rule of thumb is if it's over 5 miles from that structure, it's not going to be protected, no matter, even if it meets all the other criteria. You are over 5 miles from the fire department. That's number one. That 5 miles is the line of demarcation. That's the line in the sand. And the other thing is there needs to be a working fire hydrant within 1,000 feet of that structure. If there's not, it's not going to meet the basic criteria for protection. And for most markets, and the way we evaluate it, if it's protection class 1 to 8, it's protected. Unprotected is 9 and 10. So you cannot even get an 8 if you don't meet those 2 criteria: 5 miles responding fire department and 1,000 feet from a working fire hydrant. And then we'll go back to that in a minute, but that one comes up every day. So split classes. The reason they did the split classes is they're trying to give credit to certain jurisdictions that have done work trying to lower the class. the split class is not necessarily a bad thing. It probably means it's an up and coming community, and hopefully they'll get rid of that split class. That's the other thing too, is ISO does go out and reevaluate these things on a pretty consistent basis. So keep that in mind also. And ISO is more of a scientific type operation. I mean, they want to base this, once again, not on anything subjective. Everything is assigned to points. There's no favoritism applied. There's no subjectivity in this. It is what it is. What is the water supply? What is the water pressure? What is the equipment? They have points assigned for all of that. And ISO they spend a lot of time, well, we all know they're a rating organization too. So they produce the rates. So they want to do is they want to assign the right protection class based on the experience, taking all of those factors into play. So keep in mind, especially with, like, our program is heavy in residential builders risk and it's heavy in frame construction. So you can think about this. Do you think fire is important for frame construction? Fire protection, of course, you know that. You have two types of fire departments. You have the career fire department and the volunteer fire department. Most of you say, well, that makes sense. You know, volunteer is bad, career is good. I have seen volunteer fire departments get higher ratings than some career fire departments. That's why there is no subjectivity in this. They go ISO evaluates based on, you know, quality of equipment and the quality of the training they've received. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It's a volunteer. This is a really important screen here. We'll spend just a second on this. Protected 1 to 5. So it's 1 to 5. You're going to get the very best rates. Bottom line is the insurance carrier is going to look at that and say that's very good fire protection. I'm going to give you the lowest rates I have. You get into 6 to 8, and you start getting some carriers that are getting a little nervous because it's not as protected. Usually something is 6 to 8 because there's no working fire hydrants within 500 feet. They might be 600, 700, or 800 feet. So it still can be 6, 7, or 8 and be considered protected, but it's partially protected. So the rates are going to go up a little bit. Then you have our favorite friend, the protection class 9 and 10. Those are unprotected. And you can see what happens there. 10 is the minimum standard, doesn't even meet the minimum standard. So 10 truly doesn't meet any standards of any of this. It's the worst, and it's hard to get insurance on protection class 10 higher value structures. And just an aside too, I've been doing this for many, many years. I won't tell you how many, but I have had some losses in my career on high valued structures. We insured a $6.5 million home being built in Virginia. And I knew going in it was protection class 9, but I did the evaluation as an underwriter and everything looked good. And we wrote the coverage, builder's risk. The home was 95% done. It's going to be closed in the next month. And the fire started, and the volunteer fire department, which was a good one, got there within minutes. It was great. But they brought the wrong pumper truck, so they didn't have the right truck to extract the water from the pond. So by the time they got the right truck there, guess what? The home was fully engulfed. We had a total loss, $6.5 million. So it does happen in unprotected areas. If that had been protected, probably wouldn't have burnt down. That's just a real life example of what happened to me. I had to explain that one to my boss. That was interesting. So let's go back one before we get to this. So just to kind of wrap up protection class, once again, one of the most important rating factors in builder's risk insurance, and in fact, all of property insurance, is the ISO protection class. And we're going to go through some questions in a little while and open this up for you guys, and I'll answer any questions you have. So hopefully that sheds a little light on the protection class and why it's so important. And the last thing I want to end, I think I told you this in my last webinar, that I'm going to kind of try to weave into a little bit of marketing on our program, which we're very proud of. Victor Builders Risk, we write residential and commercial structures. We can do up to 5 million frame and up to 10 million in masonry non-combustible fire resistant. We are now in 48 states, and we're very proud of our program. We spend a lot of time. We have great coverages, 19 automatic coverages built in. So the bottom line is, I just want to give you a little brief commercial on that. We have one of the premier digital platform we call it V2. quote bind and issue within a few minutes. We had a CSR in Tennessee, quote bind and issue a policy in 1 minute and 37 seconds. So we asked the basic COPE questions. We try to ask fewer questions than other companies. I want to only ask the questions that dramatically impact the eligibility and pricing of that risk. We do ask protection class. That's one of the things that we have to have, and you have to fill that out. So, but bottom line is, if you can answer these questions, which is just the value, the deductible that you want, you got to give us the addresses where it's located. You enter that basic information, hit a button, you can get a quote, and then you hit a button and you can get a policy. And that's our goal. Just try to make this stuff as easy as possible for you. So we'll give you the contact information in a little bit. But if you have any questions on builder's risk and you want to place some business, we are open for business. How's that? Good enough. So what I like to do now is take a few minutes and see if you have any questions. Darcy, do we have any questions yet?
All right, Jeff, we do have a few questions. First one, so would a drought or a low water supply affect an area's ISO protection class?
You know, there again, absolutely, water supply is one of the major factors. So I could say if you were in an area that was rural and you were relying on local water supply, either the lake or the pond, to extract the water, and if the drought was long enough and severe enough, ISO might reevaluate. You might go from a 9 to a 10 because there'd be no water supply. And I will say this, something we don't think about. Let's say you're building on top of a mountain and you're relying on the local pond as a water supply. Well, what happens in the winter? You're in Montana or Wyoming. So ISO won't even consider that pond as an adequate water supply because it freezes part of the year, just to give you an idea. But yeah, I would say a drought could impact that. And I also say in a drought, what happens? Then we have more brush fires. We have more fires. That doesn't really affect the protection class, but it shows you how important fire protection is. Because that's what this all boils down to, is response time, how well trained is the fire department, something's going to happen, how quickly can they put that fire out? It's all based on time. Good question.
All right. Now, how do you find the protection class for a committee or a certain address?
That's a good question. So there's, a lot of times, if you're in an area in the whole city, the city limits are protection class 3, it's pretty easy if you're within those limits and it's a developed area. A lot of times you're going to find either in a rural area or in the outskirts when they're building, you might not know. So the very best place to go, and ISO even suggests this, is to call your local fire department, because they're very aware of what the ISO protection class system is all about. That's how they obtain funding. That's how they're evaluated. So I would, if I was going to be writing, property insurance in a given area, and one way to find out would be to call the local fire department and talk to them. I do know some carriers will provide that service to you. I will say though, it's interesting. I won't pick on the carrier, but I had an agent quote another carrier the other day, and I looked up the risk, and there was no working fire hydrant within 1,000 feet. So then it would dove a little deeper, and that jurisdiction had a split class. So even though they got the protection class from another carrier, this was being built in the unprotected area. So, it is what it is, not subjective, not trying to pick on anybody. But I had to tell the agent, no, this is not a 4, it's actually a 4Y, which is a 9. So they weren't real happy with me, but that is the way it is. It wasn't like I was trying to pick on them. So, call us, we can talk to you, we can help you, but we might have to, have you call the local fire department. Good question.
All right. What are some ways an insured can look to improve their protection class?
So that's the insured cannot improve the protection class. The community can improve the protection class, or the fire department can improve the protection class. Now, there's a lot of things an insured can do to mitigate fire, on a local level, like fire extinguishers, alarm systems and all of that. Obviously, we encourage that, and that improves the fire protection for that building. But as far as the protection class goes, an individual does not have control over that. And that's kind of what the whole point of this was. This is almost like a government from a body. You know, ISO is big. They're going to evaluate all these jurisdictions, and it's not individuals or individual buildings. It's jurisdictions, I guess is the word I'm looking for. So good question. And maybe, you know, we'll do another webinar one day, and maybe we'll just take a deep dive into all the things an individual owner can do to mitigate loss, like a loss control webinar. I like that. We'll do that. Write that down, Darcy. Don't let me forget. So,
You got it. All right. Next question. How often does ISO check areas?
It's a good question. I'm not so sure that they have. I do know this because I've talked to some community leaders where they can actually request ISO to come out and reevaluate. And that's what I would encourage, especially in an area that's building, they're building the infrastructure, they're putting the roads in, they're putting the fire hydrants in. So once they do that, they could request ISO to come back out and reevaluate. So I don't know if it's like a set time, they do it every year, but they're constantly reevaluating. And so I would encourage any community, you know, like I said, fire departments are always doing that because that's how they get funding. And if you go to I go to fire department websites a lot, especially some of the rural ones, and they're very proud of the ISO protection class that they've earned because it's really a way of evaluating them too. So, good question.
All right. Now for builder's risk, do you require a completed supplemental app to quote builder's risk?
Well, we have a digital platform, which we call V Squared. So I went over that. You can register for the website. You can enter the basic COPE on any structure anywhere in the 48 contiguous states. We're not in Alaska or Hawaii yet, working on that. But you enter the basic COPE and hit a button, get a quote, hit a button and get a policy. So the app is really built into the digital platform. Now, I will say if you hit 9 or 10, it's an unprotected risk. Some supplemental questions will automatically pop up. We're going to ask you, like, what is the water supply? And we'll ask a few things that kind of make you dive into PC 9 and 10. Yeah, just to give you an idea too. So in our platform, if you're in an inland area and you meet the basic criteria that pass-through risk, you can pass through a risk without having an underwriter touch it up to $3 million in value. But now if it's a PC 9 or 10, the whole generates at $1 million. So that gives you the idea of the impact of protection class. So if you're a protection class 6, you can pass through up to 3 million inland. If you're a protection class 9, you only can pass through $1 million. So it just gives you an idea. But everything's on the digital platform. We strongly encourage you to check it out. You know, it's Victor Builder's Risk. It's who we are. Good question.
All right. So for split classes, what is the difference in the alpha assigned, X versus Y?
You know, I'm going to have to get back to you. Make sure you write that. And I saw X and Y, and I was starting to look at that before the meeting today. I know they're both unprotected. I have a feeling it's going to be based on some of that criteria that we talked about, but I'll get back to you on that and explain to you. I know they're both unprotected though, either X or Y. It's kind of a way of being more finely tuned, trying to assign that number system. But I'll get an exact answer for that agent and give them a call.
Fantastic. Can you please mention the builder's risk policy limit again?
Okay, for our program, Victor Builder's Risk, if you answer those basic COPE questions, it's protected 1 to 8. The builder has 2 years experience. You're not going to change any of the coverages. You're going to go with our base package of coverages. Up to $3 million will pass through, regardless of the construction type, whether it's frame or M&C. Up to $3 million is a pass-through risk. If it's protection class 9 or 10, that cuts off at $1 million. And in coastal areas, if you're in a tier 1 county or a tier 1, there are some states like Florida, it's $1.5 million. That cuts off at $1.5 million. It doesn't mean we don't want to write higher value. It just means it's going to generate an underwriting hold, and we're going to have to talk to you and ask some extra questions. But the pass-through risk is what we'd love to write. 3 million inland, $1.5 million coastal, 1 million PC 9 and 10. Good question.
All right, and so we are at time, so let's just do one last question. When you ask for ISO PPC for a quote, how do you determine what is accurate? For example, is it based on distance from fire hydrant and fire station?
Well, when you give us the protection class for an area, we are assuming that it met all of the criteria for that protection class. And I will admit, we could spot check this, and the carrier reserves the right to do that too. I have seen carriers that will go back and reevaluate, say, well, the agent told us it was a 3, and we look at it and it's a 10. And so the carrier reserves the right to say, it should have been rated as a 10. And they can go back to policy inception and charge an additional premium based on a 10. So that's why it's really important to get it right in the beginning. That's what we want to do. And most of the time you guys do. But if it's a 3, that meant all of the qualifications for a 3. So I just like to say once again, thanks everybody for attending. If we have some other questions, I'll get the answers to you. And we print these out in the next week, right, Darcy? The questions and answers, what we get?
Yes, we do.
And we'll send that out. So once again, really appreciate your time today. Stay tuned. We'll be doing another webinar next month. I do like your ideas too. If you have ideas on webinars that are related to builder's risk, by all means, give me your ideas and that's where we'll go. So have a great day and let's write some business. Talk to you all soon.